In this video, I'm going to explain you how to apply Shaneb's Dow theory. So the Dow theory, as has been modernized and improved by Jack Shaneb in his book, The Dow Theory for the 21st Century. It is really an excellent book. It's really a must-have book. And if you want to really master the improved version of the Dow theory, I really recommend you read this book. So let's get started. The main thing you have to know about the Dow theory for the 21st century is that it's Dow theory. Don't think it's something strange, no. We use the principle of confirmation, we demand a minimum extent requirement of 3%, etc. So there are some minor modifications that answer to the setup of the markets in modern times, and it makes it even more reactive and effective than the classical Dow theory. The first improvement of the Dow theory for the 21st century over the classical Dow theory is that we use three indices. The first one is the S&P 500. In the times of Charles Dow, the S&P didn't exist. Now we have this vital piece of information. So this is the first index, and then, as with the traditional Dow theory, we have the Dow Industrials and also the Dow Transportation. The rules of the game are almost the same than those of the classical Dow theory. So there is the concept of secondary reaction, but I will explain in this video the small particularities of the Dow theory for the 21st century. Let's see how we get buy signals, for instance. So to get a buy signal, it means that we are in a bear market, lower lows, lower highs, on all indexes, lower lows, lower highs, and lower lows, lower highs. Then, let's imagine at some point that the S&P stages a rally, and this rally, as with the classical Dow theory, is equal or larger than 3%. And at the same time, something similar happens with the Dow Industrials, and something similar happens with the Dow Transportation. What is vital under the Dow theory for the 21st century is that the S&P must always be present for a signal. In other words, if, for instance, we only get a 1% rally on the S&P, while the Dow Industrials rally is 3% and the Dow Transportation rallies, let's say, 4%, then we wouldn't have a secondary reaction because the extent requirement hasn't been confirmed by the S&P 500. So, to some extent, it is easier than the classical Dow theory because before analyzing the Dow Industrials and the Dow Transportation, you may well ignore them and you just focus first on what's going on with the S&P 500. So if the S&P 500 has not met the extent requirement, at least 3%, then you may ignore what's going on here. You really don't need it. So the first rule is for a buy signal with a bear market, this is clear, but this rally should be at least 3% on the S&P, and then of course, as with the classical Dow theory, we want confirmation, but we only need confirmation from either the Dow Industrials or the Dow Transportation. So let's imagine that the Dow Industrials would have only rallied by 1%. Would we have the setup, as far as the extent requirement is concerned, for a secondary reaction? Yes, because we have more than 3% on the S&P 500 and more than 3% on the Dow Transportation. If the Dow Industrials also confirms, much better, but it is not necessary that the other two indexes confirm. So we always need the S&P 500 and or either this index or the other index or this index and this index. We don't care. 2 or 3 confirmations. But this is important. This accounts for the flexibility of Shaneb's Dow theory because you have more possibilities of getting a secondary reaction. So okay, this is the extent requirement, and what about the time requirement? Under Shaneb's Dow theory, given that we use 3 indexes, we get a higher ratio of signal versus noise. So you have an additional input. So this means that according to Shaneb's Dow theory, we only need 8 trading days, as the average of the three indexes. So let's say that the S&P 500 rallied for 10 days, 10 trading days. The Dow Industrials rallied for also 10 days. And the Dow Transportation rallied only for 4 days. So if you only had two indexes, there is not enough time for a secondary reaction. But under the Dow theory, we do as follows. We compute, we make the summation of the three and say, okay, look, the S&P, 10 days. The Dow Industrials, 10 days, and the Dow Transportation, 4 days. We add, this is 24 days, we divide by 3, we calculate the average of the 3, and 8 times 3 is 24. So this is the average time of the rally. Another condition, according to the Dow theory for the 21st century, is that we should have at least two calendar, not trading, 2 calendar weeks on any two indices. What I mean by that? Now it's not only the S&P. Provided 2 of the 3 indexes have been rallying for 2 calendar weeks, then the time requirement for a secondary reaction is met. So we have, let's say, requirement number 1 is that the average should be at least 8 trading days, and requirement number 2 is that at least 2 calendar weeks on any 2 indices. So as you can see, this is much more flexible than the classical Dow theory. Remember that the Dow theory required 3 weeks of confirmed prices. Here we already demand 2 calendar weeks, and we have 3 indexes, which means that it's much easier to get a combination, and only an average of 8 trading days. So, okay, in this specific case, this movement here, it's been, let's say, 3%, more 3 than 3% on the S&P. It has been more 3 than 3% on the Dow Industrials, and more than 3% on the Dow Transportation. And as I showed before, the time requirement has also been met. So we have the extent requirement, and the time requirement have been met. So as with the original Dow theory, what happens next is vital. So now we have 2 options. Now let's imagine we get a pullback. Now we get a pullback, goes down on the indexes, and this pullback, once again, first you must focus on the S&P 500. So it makes things easier for you. So focus on the S&P 500. So this pullback must be at least 3 or more % down on the S&P. You don't care what is going on the others. If the S&P is not down at least 3%, you ignore. Even if the other 2 indexes are going down by 10%, we don't care. For the setup of a buy signal to be completed, we need the S&P to drop by 3% or more during 2 or more days. And once these 2 conditions are met on the S&P 500, then we move on and see what's going on with the other 2 indexes, because we only seek for confirmation in one of the other 2. So we don't need the 2 of them to confirm. So let's look at the Dow Industrials. Let's say the Dow Industrials then also drops. Remember, with the classical Dow theory, the 3% drop that completes the setup for a buy signal does not need to be confirmed. So in our case, we only need the Dow Industrials or the Dow Transportation drop by 2 days or more. One of the 2, not even the 2. We only look for confirmation in one index. So if either the Dow Industrials or the Dow Transportation drop 2 days or more, confirm the drop of the S&P 500, then the setup for a buy signal is completed. In many instances, they drop 3% or more and confirm, but I insist, the extent requirement for the drop that follows the rally doesn't need to be confirmed. So once we have this drop, then we pay attention to the secondary reaction highs. You remember, we were in a bear market, we had the secondary reaction. So we pay attention to these secondary reaction highs here, here, and here. This is the Dow transportation. And once again, now your focus will be only on the S&P 500. You will ignore the other indexes. Then, if the S&P breaks up above the secondary reaction highs, then we look for confirmation on one of the other two indexes. So the fact that the S&P 500 breaks up is not a signal. Once again, we need confirmation. But then we look confirmation either from the Dow Industrials or from the Dow Transportation. So, okay, what would happen, you may ask, if the S&P 500 did not break up, but we got a breakup by the Dow Industrials and by the Dow Transportation? According to our Dow theory, nothing. Because the S&P is the preeminent index and it must always be there. So, if the S&P 500 does not surpass the highs of this secondary reaction, then we ignore what is going on with the Dow Industrials and the transportation. So I go backwards, I delete a little bit. So let's imagine we have a breakup. So once the S&P 500 breaks up above the secondary reaction highs, then we must look at the other two indexes. So let's imagine that the Dow Industrials also broke up. This means buy. We had a break up above the secondary reaction highs, and this was confirmed by the Dow Industrials. And you may ask, hey, look, but the Dow Transportation is, as it usually happens, is lagging behind. No, I don't care, because I only need confirmation from either the Dow Industrials or the Dow Transportation. If the two confirm, much better. Well, much better. It's irrelevant. Now we are going to study what happens, how we get the sell signal in the Dow theory. So this was bear market, secondary reaction, with the reduced time requirement under the Dow theory, 8 days the average of the three indexes, and at least 2 calendar weeks on two of the indexes. We just require that at least 2 indexes are having 2 weeks, calendar weeks, correction. Then we had the pullback, and then we had the breakup, and then we got the buy signal, and I repeat, you always must pay attention first to the action of the S&P 500. Now